Good morning, everybody. It's noon, so we'll start. We're happy to have Rick Geddes here today from Cornell. He's an economist in Department of Policy Analysis and Management. He's done a lot of work on law and econ and regulation, and now has directed this program on infrastructure policy, which is related to the topic of the day. So Rick has 15 minutes, as you know. You can jump on the queue. I'll even take people in the queue early here. Rick thinks he's going to go for 20 minutes. Let's see. So Rick.
Okay, let me take it away. Thanks, Dean. Thanks to Allison for organizing this visit and the kind invitation to the Ostrom Workshop. It's an honor, pleasure to be here. For my first tour of campus is a beautiful, beautiful place. But rather than gush, I've only got 15 minutes. Let me say a little bit more about this this paper with a former student, Josh Goldman, he was an attorney at Skadden Arps, is now within a startup in infrastructure and transportation in New York City. And we really should have called this institutional economics and the cost of capital with a reference to infrastructure, because the motivation for getting into this ancient issue in economics was infrastructure. So at cost of capital, just think about the cost of money, right? The cost of finance. And of course in infrastructure, this is disproportionately important. So the largest project by dollars in North America for a while was a project up near us, which is the redo of the Tappan Zee Bridge across the Hudson. And you can just think about $5 billion as the price tag for that. So the cost of capital in infrastructure is a very important thing. What is the money actually costing in a social science sense? So the core research question of this paper, economists are sort of trained to think about social costs, is the cost of risk bearing, okay? I'm not talking about bond rates, because those can be distorted by tax treatment and other things. You can sort of make some assumptions to make the cost of debt the same. It's really the cost of risk bearing or equity capital, greater or lesser if it's borne by taxpayers or by private investors. And I'll tell you why this has currently become once again, an important research question. For economists, this is actually an interesting, almost a history of thought kind of question, because the relative cost of risk-bearing by public versus private, I'm calling them taxpayers versus private investors, but think of it as this old debate, a public versus private risk-bearing has been going on for a long time. An economist will recognize some of the biggest names in the 20th century in economics here, right? Samuelson, Vickery, Hirschleifer, Diamond, Baumol, Harburger, Arrow, and Lind have all weighed in. I don't have time to go through exactly what those different contributions said. You also notice the timing, 64, 65, through in the early 1970s, okay? For reasons I still want to explore, I think the biggest impact was Kenneth Arrow and Lind, who was actually at the Cornell Business School at the time, wrote an AER paper in 1970. And kind of, look at the timing, the culmination at the end of this, right? And this, I cannot overstate the impact that this has had on current thinking. This is going back to 1960, key passage on page 366. When the risks associated with public investment are publicly borne, the total cost of risk bearing is insignificant. And therefore the government should ignore uncertainty in evaluating investments, public investments, ... The result is obtained not because the government is able to pool, that is not diversification, okay? But because the government distributes the risk associated with it amongst a large group of people, taxpayers. So it's risk spreading that's driving the result, not diversification. Now that has continued into my world today of infrastructure delivery, because there's this thing called PPPs, which I wrote a book on, public-private partnerships. And PPPs, I won't go into the gory details because Dino will cut me off, are basically bundling elements of project delivery together in one big contract. That's design, construction, operation, maintenance, but critically financing of the project. So they call that contract a DBFOM, where all those elements, and the F is financing. And why would you do that? If you're a public owner of a bridge, a road, a tunnel, a seaport, an airport, a water system, an electrical system, whatever, you would do that partly because you can transfer some risks onto the private investors that would be retained by you, by the taxpayers, by the public. And there's a whole terminology of this. They call it risk transfer. And you're transferring, by default, all the risks of project delivery, which I've learned are enormous. Associated with any big infrastructure project, there's a lot of risk. You either retain those by the taxpayers, or you transfer those onto the private partner. The private sector doesn't like risk either. So they're going to charge you for the service of risk bearing. It's going to be incorporated into the price of the project. But it's not free if it's retained by the taxpayers either. I can tell you why I think that. So it's a question of relative pricing of the two, okay? So the whole Arrow, Lind, Harburger, Diamond literature has again become important, but not fully appreciated, I don't think, because of the PPP debate in the United States. And this is not just in the United States, it's global. But it's kind of weird for the United States, and I explain why. So we do something called traditional delivery, which I don't, but it relies heavily on tax-exempt muni debt. I won't go into the other gory details. But what's happened is there's a whole consulting world here that compares PPP delivery on one side versus traditional tax-exempt muni debt delivery, and deliver a bidding structure that's called design bid build that I won't go into. But what's happened is they say, look, go back to Arrow and Lind, the public sector has a lower cost of capital. That means that the private sector partner has to be additionally more efficient to overcome that lower cost of capital hurdle. And since these are sometimes multi-billion-dollar projects, that has to be a really big efficiency benefit. And I've read 10 consulting reports that say this. So I started thinking, what? Where's the efficiency benefit of lower cost of capital on the taxpayer side coming from? So I went back, and it goes back to this old literature. And Arrow and Lind keeps coming up again. So I think this has distorted a huge margin of, and it's not just me saying this, a huge margin of decision-making between public and private delivery of public goods in the infrastructure. An enormous margin has been distorted by this, okay? And I think the economics profession has fallen down on the job because they're allowing this literature that has changed, I think, since 1970. However, some people still invoke the Arrow and Lind theorem in relatively recent I know Marion, Missouri very well, by the way, in relatively recent literature as being sort of the current correct, thinking on the relative cost of capital. In fact, the cost of capital for the government is sometimes taken as a government bond rate. They ignore the equity piece altogether, okay? That means that you're implicitly assuming that taxpayers can bear the risk of the residual risk of the project at zero cost, okay? Now, some other people, who are some of my heroes, have started to call this out, okay? And say, this is not right, this ain't right. We should do something about this. And this hero is not Robert E. Lucas Jr., but this is Debbie Lucas, and Debbie is at the MIT Sloan School of Business. If you're interested in this area, I push you to her work, which is tremendous. So that's why I have a long block quote from Debbie, okay? And Debbie's saying, wait, stop, everybody stop. Mostly non-academic observers suggested market risk is not costly to the government because the government can borrow at the risk-free treasury rate. Yes, but the problem with this reasoning is that the cost of debt financing is only one component. There's like an equity component. When the government finances risk investment on suddenly safe treasuries, investment risk is shifted onto current and future taxpayers and other federal stakeholders, and this is the key sentence, who effectively become equity holders in a leverage investment. And Debbie goes on to explain, if that's true, why not just borrow at the treasury rate and invest in the S&P 500? You've created a money machine. just do that. Well, wait, there's something wrong with that. Of course, the taxpayer's then taking on the added risk of the S&P 500 over the treasury rate, right? So it's not free, it's not free. But what is the proper pricing, right? So now, the analysis just becomes a question of the relative pricing of the two types of risk. But here I get into language of two papers that I love. They're side by side in the Journal of Law and Economics in 1983. by Fama and Jensen, and that's about the role of residual claimants. And residual claimants are those who have a property right to the net cash flow of the project. They can assert a legal claim to the residual. That's why they're called residuals, whatever is left over at the end. And Debbie is effectively, I interpret her as saying, that taxpayers become the de facto residual claimants in these projects that they finance. It's just that the government accounting doesn't properly account for the risk on the government balance sheet that you would in a private company. So any private company accounts for the equity cost of capital, right? And they do that on the balance sheet. And Debbie's saying that's, so one of her big things is government accounting. This is where this gets fun for the Ostrom workshop. This, in my mind, is a comparison of two sets of institutional arrangements. And those are the institutional arrangements for managing risk. And, you know, one set is residual claims surrounding private institutions. Limited liability has evolved over 100 or more years. Trading, shares, so this is all going back to Fama and Jensen. Papers versus taxpayers. Now, it's not as though the governments have zero ways of managing risk, but it's really a comparison of the differing institutional arrangements where I think this should go, okay? So you're really gonna cut me off at 15. All right, let me just give a couple of things that Josh and I have kind of pointed out. It's not as though this paper comes to some grand conclusions and says, here is the answer. I think it's more it's a call for economists to talk about this debate again, to come back but bring in new thinking in institutional economics to bear on the relative cost of capital debate. I sound like a broken record, but I can't stress how important this is in the infrastructure policy world. Old, bad thinking has distorted this discussion about PPPs. Here's a couple of examples of how I think it could be pushed, okay? One is the whole agency cost literature. I teach corporate law and economics. I've taught it for 20 years. The core of that class is agency costs, right? It's how do you get the managers who control the resources of a big corporation to run the corporation in the interest of these tiny little atomized shareholders. This actually goes back, I don't know if it's on the next, it's not on the next slide, so I don't want to scoot ahead. But Burl and Means, 1934 book, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, launched a huge thesis that the managers were making off with the store, basically, and these little atomized mom and pop investors were being taken advantage of by the modern corporation. They even attribute partly the Great Depression to the rise of the modern corporation and agency costs. But then you go over to the taxpayer side, and it's virtually devoid. It's not there, right? The agency structure as applied to taxpayer risk bearing is virtually absent. They're almost assumed that the public managers are perfect, you know, agents of the principals, where the taxpayer citizens are the principals. So the literature has not evolved to examine mechanisms to control agency costs on the taxpayer as much as it has on the private investor side. So you need a relative institutional comparison. However, I will say, since I like corporate governance literature, this question is settled. It goes across countries, it goes across legal regimes. If you have poor corporate governance, poor reporting, less transparency, less constraints on the board structure so that you have outsiders on the board, you pay for it through the share price, right? In other words, a higher cost of capital. So the corporate governance world is decided on this, they agree on it, but it hasn't been applied to the public side, particularly in the context of infrastructure delivery. I can go on, but I've only got 1 minute. The other
2 or 3.
Yeah, 2 or 3?
That's fine.
All right, you're being generous, Dean. This is a new dean I've never met before.
2019.
You're getting soft in your old age. All right.
You're losing your minutes.
Oh, boy. All right.
He's digressing.
All right, finally let's go to number 3. So just think about limited liability. Limited liability is one of the most, it was invented by the Dutch, I believe, and then the British, of course, took it over and really pushed on the corporation. The Dutch invented the limited liability corporation. One of the most key legal evolution is that your investment is limited to the amount you invest, right? So you go out and buy a share of Apple this afternoon, the most you risk is the amount you invest in Apple. Next week, Apple will go to zero, you lost your investment. But your upside is unlimited, right? Just let it run. And that's a great thing. And Easterbrook and Fischel's, the book I use, does a wonderful job of explaining the social benefits of limited liability. But think about that in the taxpayer context. If taxpayers bear the risk the project goes south, they build a new toll bridge, and it costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and nobody comes and pays the toll. But they still have the debt. What are they going to do? They're going to raise taxes, cut back on public services. They're going to do all these other things to the taxpayers of that jurisdiction. So go back to Debbie's quote. They are the equity holders in a risky investment. But there's nobody who comes along and says the legal rule of limited liability applies. What do you think that does to the cost of capital? Well, it's not measured properly, but my guess is if you could properly measure it, it would be increased enormously. Then a couple of other, just throwing out some institutional economics ideas in my final minutes. There's a great paper by Demsetz and Len that's in the JPE in 1985 that studies ownership concentration in corporations. Their basic point is that it's endogenous, right? The takeaway is that the concentration of ownership in big corporations is not what Berlin means, these tiny little atomized mom and pop investors who are just getting taken for a ride. It can be large institutions. It can be a pension fund, a mutual fund, an insurance company, a university endowment, who are not mom and pop. They are sophisticated investors who will hold the managers accountable. And so it's endogenous, and they show, I recommend this paper, they show that the ownership concentration responds in predictable ways to various exogenous forces. So you cannot have that in a taxpayer-funded, taxpayer risk-bearing situation. In other words, ownership concentration is determined by the size of the jurisdiction. If you just think each house, suppose it's a state, and it's a state project, like the Tappan Zee Bridge. So all the taxpayers of the state of New York bear the risk proportionally, and it's fixed. The ownership concentration is just fixed. Yeah, so that's a mechanism I would think of for helping to control the cost of capital that is available on the private side, but not available on the public side. Specialization of labor, right? As we know, one of the key things that private investors do is they are experts in risk management, where taxpayers are not. How many minutes, what do I have left, Dean?
No, not much.
Not much, let me just.
If you want to get these questions.
Absolutely, let me see what I've got next. Yeah, that's just showing this. Okay, let me just do this and then so just another institutional element where if you were to do the comparison, one of the main innovations, right, in corporate ownership is limited liability, right? Centuries old. And it evolved over time. The other one that's even more, some bright person, probably a Dutch person, said, let's trade these things. Let's make them tradable. Let's make the shares of company not all divisible. We can cut them up into little pieces, little shares of Apple stock, but you can also trade them on a stock market. There's economists here. What does trading do? It establishes a price, right, for the residual claim. So you get tradable residual claims. And I'm pretty sure there's agreement in the corporate law and economics world that this has a big effect on agency costs. You can watch what the performance of a big CEO is doing for his or her firm just by observing the stock price. And if the share price of Apple drops relative to some index, and we can quibble about the index, maybe there's something going on inside the firm, or maybe the managers are not doing their job sufficiently for owners. So you have a really clear, objective monitoring device that you cannot argue with, right? The stock price is just the stock price. But you don't have that in the case of taxpayer risk-bearing. There's no stock price. There's equity stakes, as Debbie Lucas says. There's risk-bearing, but there's no objective price to observe the performance of public sector managers. So that would be another thing. I will conclude with a call for suggestions on how to measure this. In other words, could we use experimental economics to somehow measure? There's no good data. The data is really bad. There's no good data on, the relative cost of risk-bearing across the two groups. Could we somehow construct experiments? Can anybody suggest another way of measuring it? If you think there's a difference in the cost of capital, the next question is how big is the difference? And we have virtually no empirical handle on that. So if you have any suggestions on that, let me know.
Okay.
I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
Sure.
So we'll take the cue. We have Bob first, then Michael and Brian, and just raise your
Boy,
hand.
this takes me back to my corporate finance roots. I'm loving it, and this is
Great.
really
Isn't it fun?
provocative. Yeah, it really is fun, and
Yeah.
working my way through your equations too is really quite a treat. Enjoying it
It's
very much.
Brealey and Myers. That's
Yeah,
basically.
no, it's been around for a while, but these kinds of applications to the public sector are few and far between. Mainly because it's not easy. It's hard, as you point out.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if it's possible to look at. It's possible to look at how, for broad real estate markets, how a great deal of debt associated with public-private partnerships in certain jurisdictions might be capitalized in the market values of properties, and try to get a sense if that's a kind of a loose measure of taxpayer wealth, then I wonder if there might be some way to tease out just what the bump might be, or in the case of failed public-private partnerships, what the discount in the market values might be relative to similar parcels in maybe directly adjacent jurisdictions, doing some kind of an attribute matching routine, just to try to get empirical. Otherwise, and that's hard, so otherwise what I'm thinking is maybe some kind of experimental approach would be necessary.
Yeah, I mean, there's hedonic pricing in, for a lot of things in real estate.
Yeah.
It all should be incorporated into the price of the housing or, yeah. I'd have to think through how you would do this, and what sort of a natural experiment would give you this differential.
Require a lot of
It's hard.
data on specific jurisdictions, and you
Yeah.
have to figure out what are the relevant attributes. You might rule out more than you rule in, actually.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion, but again, it's all going to be driven by the availability of data for this.
Yeah, Michael.
I have a couple of comments. So first, you're assuming that all taxpayers are the same, but of course all taxpayers are not.
What's
the
that
same.
then?
So all taxpayers are not the same, and some of them pay a lot more in taxes and expect to pay a lot more in taxes and are much more exposed. So it's not, of course, the same thing as the concentration of ownership, but it might be interesting to look into the different exposure of different taxpayers to future taxes. And so our political system, it does take account to some extent of these things because richer people have more influence. The second comment is that what you described there at one point is very similar to the standard model of a soft budget constraint. You never mention it, but it's basically that thing. It's where the project is failing, instead of cutting your losses, so you invest more. And that used to be applied only, or it used to be said that this thing is only relevant for state financing, but it's relevant to big banks as well, and there are plenty of examples of that. So it's not entirely true that it's only a problem, the soft budget constraint is only a problem with taxpayer financing, it can be a problem. So when banks are reluctant to show losses, so they keep refinancing a project even though it should have been stopped. And then I have a question also. At one point you say, well, the bondholders are protected by strong contractual arrangements and all that. That's true, but I don't see how it's relevant. I mean, the basic point I think that you are making there is that the bond prices are adjustable, and because losses are going to go to bondholders if equity is wiped out, right? The residual losses are going to go there. So the interest rates on bonds that are issued by private investors, they reflect the fact that it's not only the equity holders who could suffer, it's also the bondholders, right?
Yeah.
So I don't see why it's relevant. I think you should say there that the cost of risk to private enterprise is reflected both in the risk borne, the limited risk.
Yeah.
So borne by limited liability enterprises, and by the interest charged by the bondholders.
So, yeah, so there's a lot there. Dean, he said I was allowed to do this. I could scoot ahead.
Sure.
So I agree there's a lot in what you said. So I think if you look at the paper, there's one section where I'm trying to address, I think, a number of your concerns.
Okay.
And, let me see. So, we consider a hypothetical infrastructure project, right?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do is get to ceteris paribus, right? I'm trying to abstract away from a lot of what you said. So, we talk about this bridge, right? And it's a toll bridge. And, I'm trying to, it's silly, but I'm trying to hold everything else constant except who the risk bearers are, okay? So it's going to be designed, constructed, operated by one or more private companies. They're going to be the same companies, whether it's financed through a private investment, through a PPP, or whether it's financed exclusively with tax-exempt muni debt. It's going to be operated under a contract the same way. Toll rates, I assume, are going to be set by this regulator out there, so that everything's the same. The other thing that is key, Michael, is that it's going to be financed on the public side with what are called revenue bonds. So that is bonds that are funded, that are backed only by the revenue of the bridge. So there's no recourse to the public owner. So what I'm trying to do in this hypothetical is get to this corporate finance. So if you say, what's the cost of capital? Well, if somebody's talking corporate finance, they think of the weighted average cost of capital. So this is the bond rate here. This is debt in the capital structure. This is equity in the capital structure. So what I'm trying to do is hold this constant, right? Yes. So that you only focus, and I assume that the amount of equity in the capital structure is unaffected by whether it's PPP delivery or entirely public. To focus on this, right? So I'm trying to hold the bond issue, take that out of the equation, and then focus strictly on the equity cost of capital, okay? And one thing in the paper, I didn't put it in the slides, you get it at the capital asset pricing model that gets at this. And, I don't have time, but there's other things that have been put into the capital asset pricing model. Small firm effect, other things. What we would like, basically, is this coefficient gamma on there, which would be the institutional structure. Like, how does the institutional structure affect the equity cost of capital? Abstracting away from any differences that would affect the bond rate. Okay, so that's where I'm saying that the corporate law and economics people have done a lot of work in corporate governance that shows clearly that institutions matter. But they haven't then applied that on the public versus private sector cost of capital debate, right? So Do you see what, so I'm trying, when you talk about bond rates, I'm trying to do everything I can to abstract from any systematic public-private differences in the bond rate.
So that's fine.
Okay.
You seem to be addressing like a question, and the question really is not important. I think the comments are more important. That so that taxpayers are different. So it's one comment, and the second comment is that the soft budget constraint, even though it's more likely to happen with state financing, it can easily happen with private financing as well. So those are the two more important comments, I would say.
Okay, so, yeah, I agree entirely that, on both.
Okay.
Yeah, I would like to abstract from
Oh,
those.
well, let's move on. We have Brian, and then we have a list that's built.
No, it's-
Well, first is just a small quibble to try to get the, let's call it the null hypothesis, a little more teeth to it, which is, if you think, and this might actually help with the pricing also, if you think that taxpayers are fully diversified and you think that the risk of failure for the project is going to be uncorrelated with the market, let's call it beta equals 0,
Yeah.
then I think the hypothesis is the arrow hypothesis here is actually right, because if beta is 0, cap M would suggest the equity cost of capital will equal the treasury rate. And so now the question then would be, why is either one of the two assumptions that underlie that not true? Why, one, are taxpayers not fully diversified?
Right.
Or two, the risk of project failure is not uncorrelated with the market. Two is probably, you probably have some teeth on two.
I do.
And to the extent you could show that, that will help, I think, just punt the null hypothesis out of there, and then maybe trying to unpack in more of a finance sort of way how to think through what that cost might be.
Yes, so just great points. You're right on there with the Arlind theorem. On the first one, I don't have as good a handle on it, on the diversification of taxpayer versus investors.
Yeah.
You know, because the two groups you'd be comparing are the taxpayers of the jurisdiction, whoever owns the bridge. It could be a city, could be a municipal bridge, could be a state, could be federal, versus the diversified taxpayers that invest in the equity of a PPP. So on number one, I don't have a good answer. On number two, the 2008 global financial crisis actually provided us with pretty decent data that assumption is violated, right? That the returns on infrastructure projects, are highly correlated with the economy, right?
Yeah.
In ways that were kind of shocking to because, I remember this, people said, well, even if there's a downturn in the economy, people are gonna still pay the tolls on the roads. They're still gonna, they're still gonna use the bridges and tunnels. And it turns out that when there's a big downturn like that, people go to work less, they shop less, they don't have as many jobs. So the tolls on a lot of toll projects actually dropped a lot in 2008. So, they're highly correlated.
Okay.
So that violation in the
That's helpful for you,
is
I
violated.
think.
But that's a good point. Yeah.
And one other, I think, small point, but you pointed out how limited liability isn't being priced here. Limited liability actually wasn't very well priced in early finance theories early. Limited liability starts to show up if you start shifting to an option pricing model, because in that case, equity starts to look like basically the same thing as an option where the strike price of the option is paying off all the debt. So I think you are in a world where equity or option pricing is just not applicable for pricing the shareholder as residual claimant, because
You mean on the taxpayer side?
yeah, on the sorry, did I say the shareholder or taxpayer? On the taxpayer side, option pricing doesn't make good sense.
Okay.
Precisely because they aren't really a residual claimant in the option sense the way equity is, where equity is an option claimant in the sense that you have to pay off all the debt first and then they get whatever's left over.
Right.
And it's on the downside, it works the other way, which is limited liability cuts their risk. So I think option pricing just doesn't work well.
So remind me of the link, I'm a little out of my depth, between option pricing and limited liability.
So option pricing works on, I think, in two ways. So one, I'm getting this confused. On the upside, the strike price is, on the downside, how does it work? Your value never goes below 0.
Right.
So
Oh, yeah.
that's not true here. They have something that's not like, their value actually can go below what they put into it.
Right, that's the point.
Yeah, and so that sort of pricing mechanism doesn't really fit here. I think that's fine for you,
But it helps us, right?
yeah, I think it does. Both of these are meant as helpful comments. I'm just trying to think of ways to put some teeth or using existing theory and show that what you're suggesting isn't inconsistent with corporate finance, I don't think.
Right, but it has never been
I don't think it's just unpacked.
thought about.
Yeah. That's it.
Tony.
So this was interesting, and I was wondering, it's less about the mechanics of the model and everything like that, and more about kind of the general theory,
Yeah.
especially on the risk sharing and the risk spreading idea.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely within the case of the U.S., I mean, you already mentioned the different levels of government, but what would your theory extend to, say, infrastructure projects by, say, a Canadian firm in, say, the Global South, funded by, say, a World Bank development project, right? So it's risk shedding across multiple countries to a Canadian firm doing work that's clearly removed from the taxpayers there that kind of indirectly goes to the World Bank. I was just wondering, is there something about being within the same jurisdiction as a taxpayer that's necessary here, or would that be like a really extreme kind of situation for your kind of theory and your model?
No, I mean, I think the core concept is what is the identity of the residual claimants?
A Canadian firm,
The
right?
Canadian, but it's private, right? It's a
You're right, yeah.
Canadian investor,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So in that case, our analysis, it's independent of jurisdictions in the sense that it would be the residual claimants of the Canadian investor as residual claimants versus some government entity that does not allow private investment. And I haven't gone into the gory details of PPP delivery where you create a special purpose vehicle. The thing that issues the debt and equity is actually that special purpose vehicle, right? And it's created by the lawyers who, these big companies team up with each other. It could be a construction company, design company, operating company, and a bank and others team up through the SPV. The SPV issues debt and equity to actually execute the project, right? So the Canadian investor would be investing in the equity of the SPV, right? Right. So this, and then versus, that's the PPP delivery, versus just, the public sector delivering the project by issuing tax-exempt muni bonds. So whoever is issuing those bonds, those taxpayers are the residual claimants in that case. It doesn't matter. The equity investors in the SPV could come from Mars, as long as they're private.
Well, I guess that's
Our analysis goes through.
What if the local constituents are unable to finance the project themselves? For instance, like in the Global South, where they would be dependent on,
I see.
foreign aid,
I see.
whether it's the Belt and Road project out of China or USA and those projects, World Bank, IMF things. Does that complicate things, or does that?
It would, yeah.
Okay.
I'd have to think about the answer.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Fair. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, it's more complicated. But I'm trying to have the basic concepts of who the residual claimants are and what are the institutional arrangements surrounding that risk bearing, right? In each case, and then.
Well, if it's always the cost of equity capital for you, then it should, kind of.
I think it should. But again, I don't want to just belch out an answer.
Appreciate
Thought
it.
about it more. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Lulu.
I really enjoy reading the paper and it's very inspiring, but
Thank you.
at the end you said there is not to say the taxpayer is not, I think your conclusion is we should choose between those two depending on the institutions. I feel like when I read the paper, I was asked myself, why the taxpayer equity existed in the first place and persistent over time? Why the taxpayer equity, the model, public investing in infrastructure, existed that's first place and then over time. So
why did it?
yes, so I think if you can address a little bit more, so help us to understand what's the cost and the benefit between each project.
Oh yeah, that's a good. I mean, I can tell you, I have some thoughts on that, but yeah.
Yeah, and my second comment is, I think before going for the empirical test, I think I said this paper can build a theoretical model. So you, at the beginning, all those equations you haven't, you can put in these equations come at the beginning of the paper, but later you go on to discuss the agency cost, the transaction cost. I was expecting you could put the transaction cost in this equation, so you can have like better theoretical prediction under what conditions, with under what institutions affect the transaction cost, and then which model is better, which type of investment is better.
Yeah, yeah.
Then about the empirical side, I'm sorry, I don't know too much about the U.S.
About the data?
infrastructure.
Yeah.
But I think China offers some empirical test. So people think Chinese government invest the infrastructure from the tax or from the land leasing fee.
Yeah.
But actually there is more around 367 local government borrowing vehicles. They borrow from the market. They either directly borrow from the people or they establish a project through the shadow banking.
Yeah.
And then they borrow from the people. So I think you will see a spectrum of different interest rates of different how they structure the borrowing vehicles. So that's
Yeah. So there's a lot there. But your first question is very interesting about why. So it's kind of like a good question at the end of our paper. Why has the United States, this is really a U.S.-centric paper in some ways. Why has the U.S. evolved in this way under what we in my world call traditional delivery versus PPPs? That's always the way the debate is couched. And I think, so in other countries, this is a little less controversial, I think. And the United States is the only country that I'm aware of that has tax-exempt municipal debt. Okay, so that means if I live in the city of Ithaca, if Ithaca issues debt to renovate its water system, the holders of that debt do not pay taxes on the interest income at the federal level, right? So when they pay their federal tax in April. So that artificially, meaning the tax code, artificially lowers the cost that Ithaca has to pay, the city of Ithaca has to pay as an issuer, if it's a tax-exempt muni issue, right? Now the PPP can't do that because it's private. In other words, the debt that the SPV issues is taxable corporate debt. So what has happened is it's artificially unleveled the playing field for and these things are debt heavy. It's 80% debt and 20% equity generally for a big project, PPP project, right? So it's artificially altered the playing field through the tax code. So that has tended to crowd out PPPs in the United States. So I think what a lot of other countries are 20, 25 years ahead of the United States in terms of using PPPs. And I think this whole debate has been driven by federal tax law for a long time. I don't know if does that provide some answer for that, or? I'm not sure I got at your question, Lulu. I'm worried about that.
I'm sorry, my English is wobbly.
No, you're doing great. It's better than my Chinese.
I think, no, what I mean is, we know there's a lot of program through video paper. I understand a lot of the costs of using taxpayers.
Yeah.
But the point is, it exists.
Yeah.
So at the end, you also say that we should choose between those two. So I don't understand what's the benefits of using those taxpayer equities.
So this probably reflects the debate that Josh, my co-author, and I have had about this, and I think Josh is a lawyer by training, and I think we he's kind of trained to hedge things a little bit more. I think we probably would have pushed, if it had just been me, I would have pushed at stronger conclusions toward the end of the paper. I think what you're reading is Josh kind of moderating me a little bit. That's kind of a weak answer, but I think that's probably what the paper seems a little schizophrenic, maybe, in that, which reflects the debate that Josh and I were having about the thrust of the paper. He wanted to moderate our conclusions a little bit.
So
I know that's unsatisfying, but it's true.
So you believe we should privatize all the infrastructure?
No. Privatized, I very rebel against that term because that means an actual transfer of title. To me, in my world, the word privatization is vastly overused. That's privatization when it's a lease or a concession, which is, if I lease my house, I don't sell my house. Those are different things. Anyway, it's a personal thing with me. So I would not do that, but I would do a lot more PPPs, which are concessions or leases of 30, 40, they're long term, 30, 40 years perhaps. You know, but leasing out operation and maintenance of your water system is not the same as selling your water system. You know, anyway, that'll get me into a different area, but you can see what I'm kind of getting to. But I would have a lot more PPPs, right? I would have a lot more private involvement in, you know, in this sort of thing. But Lily, I do want to address your second point on transaction costs, which I agree with entirely. So if you sort of read the subtext of the paper, the thinking in this paper pushed us in the direction of this term, right? Focusing on this expected return on equity capital to compensate for risk. And that pushed us in the direction of the capital asset pricing model, which is finance I haven't done since graduate school. It was 100 years ago, right? And so there's this whole literature that I would love to get into more on. People since I was in graduate school have added stuff into the capital asset pricing model in really fun and interesting ways. And I seem to recall more being finance people thinking more about transaction costs. And that got me into this, if you read the paper on the gamma term, the difference in the difference that institutional arrangements make between the public and the private sector, how does that drive the cost of capital, right? That drove us there. But there's this other literature that I'm really don't feel comfortable with on transaction costs and the CAPM. So I'm just going to say I think it's out there in the literature, but I don't feel comfortable today talking about it. So two very weak answers to you. Sorry. But good questions.
We're looking for good answers.
Sorry.
Good answers next time.
You're going to make me pay.
So Jessica.
Jessica.
You're up.
Okay, I will preface this by saying I'm way out of my depth with this paper, which I found incredibly clearly written and interesting, but
Thank you.
totally different from anything that I work on. So one of the things that then came to mind, especially around page 15 or 16 where you're talking about what kind of sounded to me a little like the soft budget constraint problem. Is there a political cost of capital?
Yes, I think so. Well, I mean, it's pretty across countries, like the governance structure across countries will affect the cost of capital. Yeah.
So I guess I was thinking about, it seems like there's a temporal question here about electoral cycles and the possibility that depending on the duration of a contract for the project and the electoral cycle, right, that there could be, that getting back to both the question of soft budget constraint and also a diversity of taxpayer, right, might then mean that the nature of the way that different institutions play out depends in part on where you are, for instance, in the electoral cycle, and how you expect that the public financing might play out if the project fails, or if they have to go back and raise taxes to finance the debt. So I was sort of wondering, again, this might be outside of the scope of what you actually are interested in trying to explain or understand, but it seemed to me that there was if you're going to talk about the way in which Lulu was sort of putting these two issues, comparing the public and a PPP option, that it would be helpful to think a little better about or mention the extent to which the public financing option also has potentially some political constraints associated with it that might affect the cost of capital.
Yeah, so I mean, let me say, I'm teaching a class in infrastructure policy right now, and the block quote in the intro to the syllabus is from Adam Smith, talking about how political infrastructure is, basically. He talks about it in 1776 language, but your point is well taken, like this is all done in a very political environment. And that's because, this gets to Lulu's question, the owners of almost all the infrastructure we're concerned about, the actual owners, it's not like there's free infrastructure out there. Somebody owns it, is a government entity. So when you're talking about particularly new projects, which we call greenfield projects, it's almost inherently political. And it would be interesting to know sort of how political cycles affect that. I have to think through, you're catching me off guard in the sense that I don't even have a good framework for thinking about how it might impact the cost of capital. I really have to mull that over, Jessica, but I think your point is very well taken. I'll just give a quick footnote to your point that might be kind of fun. So one of the big holdups, if anybody who knows this world knows that one of the big issues in delivering a project is NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, permitting, right? And it's extremely slow in the United States. And there's been law review kind of people who write about the NEPA process, amazingly little empirical analysis of NEPA. And so with a couple of co-authors, we've gathered some data on environmental approvals, NEPA process environment, and it's shocking. Some projects are delayed 20 years in our data set, awaiting NEPA. And it could be Endangered Species Act, it could be Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, whatever it is in NEPA, right? But we found this giant Trump effect of all these projects. We call it the Trump bump. We don't understand it, but it's clear that before he was sworn in, all these projects were approved that had been waiting for NEPA approval were approved. And so, that's just part of the clearly political permitting approvals, right? So anyway, that's just a footnote to what you said.
Just in
But
terms of implementation.
I agree.
It could be the start, like, in the
Yeah.
immediate aftermath of an election or right before a new one, you could compare. I would think you could compare based on where in the project you were.
Yeah, I mean, and there is this whole thing. So this is a huge industry, right? And there's the consultants, these there's a cottage industry in analyzing the risks. And one of the biggest risks is just regulatory risk. And that's a bucket of a whole bunch of risks associated with project delivery. It could be environmental permitting, but it could be politics. So your point is very well taken, but I just don't have a good answer.
I'm gonna jump in here real quick, then we've got a couple more. Is there a way you could turn this into kind of a comparative statics exercise to predict when you would have a private or a public or a joint investment? So if you have a real small municipality, for example,
Yeah.
they're not gonna meet even the idealized conditions of Arrow Lynn, and it may be cheaper for them to go out to a large company to provide water, for example.
Right.
If you're in New York City, it's a different thing. So I think what's sort of lacking for me, at least, there wasn't this comparative static sort of implications derived in the context of analysis.
But do you mean comparative status on when you do a P3 versus traditional?
It could be that, it could be the efficiency of management, it could be you made some kind of empirical claims without data. And so can you derive some of these results from the kind of setup you've got started here?
Do you mean empirically or in a theoretical?
Well, I mean theoretical implications, and then one could go out, you could get data on whether it's a municipal run or a private corporation running the water supply, for example.
Yeah. So I probably did a poor job with the literature review here, in the sense that there's a group of scholars who, there's some theoretical work that would give you the modeling of that, right? That would predict, if you make some assumptions, when you would use a P3 and when you would use traditional delivery. And there is some other empirical work on it for different sectors, like highways. This has been done a lot in Southern Europe, Australia, Canada, that would get at some of that. But again, I'd have to go back and sort of reassess that empirical literature and see. But, we didn't attempt that here, but it'd be good to extend that in this context, yes.
Okay, Michael's back, and then Tony, he's back too.
Just a couple of small points.
Yep.
So you're making a very good point that the interest rates on debt do not necessarily reflect the cost of capital, the cost of bearing risk. But isn't it also true that other things equal, the lower the interest rate, the more, or the greater the difference between the private interest rate and the government interest rate, the relatively more efficient than would government financing be? Because it's not only the non-academic people. I mean, I read it in Krugman and in Summers, who are saying, especially at the federal level, that hey, interest rates are zero basically, so we should invest a lot. And so you're saying it's not really true, right? But I'm saying that maybe, at least in relative sense, it might be true that it's better to invest, for the government, when the real rate is zero than when the real rate is 5 or 6%.
Yeah.
And the other small comment is just, you might want to look at that literature. So So the comment you made that you are pushing for the PPPs and all that, that Schleifer and a couple of co-authors so did a fair amount of work on private versus government ownership.
Yeah, there's a Journal of Economic Perspectives.
And the QG paper.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's about contracting. I mean, the state versus market, I think it's called something like that.
It's called.
It's about whether it's
State
contractable.
versus private ownership.
Yeah, it's a very good paper.
Yeah.
And I agree, and that's certainly relevant here. Let me go back to your first point though, and I think it's a good one. So I think in some sense, what this boils down to, and this is again, I'm sort of channeling Debbie Lucas here, is like a call for better government accounting.
Sure.
For risk.
Yeah.
Right? And so if you say, well, look, the government can borrow at 1% or something like that, fine, of course, that's a lower cost to the US Treasury of borrowing, right? And you should do it now rather than when interest rates are 6% or something like that. And I agree with that. It's a lower cost to the taxpayer, and if you wait and interest rates are higher, you've incurred a higher cost. But for projects, right, like this that I'm interested in, there's this key distinction where if it's privately delivered, they use a system of accounting that will account for the deferred liabilities and other risks on the private sector balance sheet. And we should do something similar for the taxpayer balance sheet. So I think that's all, and if that pans out that, it's better to borrow now at 1% than wait until interest rates go up, absolutely, right? So I think it kind of boils down to this. But then, of course, the question becomes, how do you properly account for taxpayer risk on the balance sheet? Nobody wants to really, Debbie has been banging her head against the wall for a decade, but, it's still, the question is out there. And I really think that our type of stuff, institutional economics, has the tools to really help with that and to really better understand. And it's really Michael, a question of pricing. How should you price the risk that taxpayers bear? And for whatever reason, which you could probably write a book on, why public sector accounting has not done that for the past 100 years, is interesting. So it almost boils down to that, but it gets you into, I think, these fascinating institutional questions about the pricing of risk. If it's borne by the private investors of a Canadian investor versus taxpayers of whatever jurisdiction. And you made the point that they're different. Yes, absolutely. So the state of New York taxpayers are different than the city of New York taxpayers and the federal, right?
Well, I would say that within the city of New York, there are very different taxpayers.
Oh, yeah, there's heterogeneity amongst, of course, I agree entirely, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the way I would think about it.
That's the sort of thing you could turn to comparative statics, where you take into account heterogeneity, and then how does this play out?
Yeah.
The relative.
You mean grinding through a model of.
Yeah. We have Tony and the queue is open after that, so if you want to jump in.
Well, actually, Jessica's question kind of reminded me of Chicago 2008 when it leased out all of its parking meters to, right, for like 1.1 billion, which was the year after Daley's final re-election.
Right.
But they leased it out for 1.1 billion, but they were criticized because people say they could have gotten 4 times that. So this idea of maybe even there might, I don't know. Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting kind of motivation there. That.
So maybe we should talk about it.
Yeah.
So what Tony's talking about is perhaps the worst PPP the United States has ever done, which was to lease out I forget the length of the contract, but it was a 30-year contract, the operation and maintenance of parking meters in the city of Chicago. And as we know, so Michael, the one thing that the paper that you reference is sharp, hard incentives, versus softer incentives.
Yeah, high powered.
So guess what you do when you lease out you give sharp incentives. So these people were actually monitoring if your car was over the time limit, they'd go out and give you a ticket right away. There's more technology. You can actually have high-tech parking meters. But people went crazy, right? and they just, rebelled as soon as a private operator took over. They were used to parking in Chicago, and maybe if the meter run over, the city's not going to bother you, but that's not true under private operation, right? And so they probably, you're right. And my guess is that the city of Chicago could have done a much better job of both bidding and monitoring
Right.
the PPP.
But even that had happened after his final election, the mayor's.
You mean that he did that?
That political cycle, I mean, he didn't do it earlier in his election, or earlier in
He
his,
did it when he was on the way out.
in his final term, yeah.
Right.
After being elected in 2007. Right.
Yeah, so there's a lot of bad reasons to do
Yeah.
PPPs. So that actually gets at, when are they socially beneficial?
Yeah.
Chicago parking meters is not, not an example of that. We could talk about other Chicago PPPs, like the Chicago Skyway.
Sure,
They
fair.
leased out,
That's a
which
good
was
one.
awful. But anyway, it was a 99-year lease. It might as well be
Oh.
infinite. It was
Okay, it's
99 years.
noon. Rick?
Sorry.
It's 1, sorry. So time is up. Thank you very
Man.
much. People can find Rick right here. There's lunch upstairs for those of you signed up, and then you can email him. He's around this afternoon.
Yep,
So thank you very much.
happy to talk.
Yeah.